Thank you, Dave, and thank you to everyone for coming. I'm glad the sky didn't open before lunch because I know it would have been harder to get here, and I hope they won't open until after you get back wherever you're going. I want to right away start out by acknowledging my co-author on this work, Liz Strajewski, who's sitting right here, and who. I also want to acknowledge the many, many people who helped us with this work, some of whom are in the room, who helped. We could not have done this without contacting a lot of folks at the local, state, and federal level to sort of find out what's happening with their water marketing and their groundwater banking programs without reviews. And then you're going to hear from a great distinguished panel of practitioners after I give you an overview. So this is not the first time that PPIC has done work on water marketing. In fact, our very first water report was on the water market, and it's about 10 years ago. So we thought it was a good time to do an update. And what I'm mainly going to talk to you about is that update, which is really, the subtitle of the report is By the Numbers. So it's mainly going to be giving you a quick overview on some data. But I just want to start first with a little bit of background on what it is we're talking about. I know some of you in the room live and breathe this stuff, but others don't, and try to make sure we're all on the same page about this. So we're looking in this report at water marketing and groundwater banking, which are two related, I would say, modern tools for water management that California has been officially aiming at doing, especially over the last 30 years, and really kind of from the policy perspective, the push for this really started after a very severe drought in 1976-77, and after that there was a governor's commission that was looking at water rights and looked at both groundwater management and at water marketing, and we have one of the authors of that here in the room, Cliff Lee, who's with the Attorney General's office. There was also a report done by the RAND Corporation for the state legislature looking at these things, and in the years that followed, a number of changes were made in legislation to facilitate these tools. The state has been supporting this with money in some cases for grants to support it, through some active purchasing, as you'll see. And the federal government, which is obviously also a big player in water in California because it owns and manages the Central Valley Project, and it's also the water master for the Colorado River Project, which is important for California. The feds have also played a key role in helping to try to push these things along. So we're talking about water marketing, which is the transfer in exchange for compensation of the rights to use water. California, especially surface water, rights are pretty well apportioned and known who has them. And the idea is to make that available on a temporary, long-term, or even permanent basis to somebody else in exchange for compensation. Groundwater banking, this is the idea of storing water under the ground in aquifers, in particular what technically is known as conjunctive use of groundwater and surface water, where you're basically effectively storing surface water in space underground. And this is a particularly effective thing to do when you've got wet years and you can store more water underground, and then the groundwater reserve, the groundwater basins can be a very effective drought management tool. Water markets also can be very effective for managing droughts because folks that have relatively low value uses of the water can be willing to make that available to folks for whom the costs of shortages would be higher in exchange for compensation. Water marketing in particular is also very useful for accommodating long-term shifts in the economy and the shifts in demand that go with that, especially if you think about our water system overall as not having a lot of margin for expanding overall supplies anymore. We have to think more and more about how to manage it efficiently. Water markets allow you to do that in a way that compensates the people who've made the initial investments in the rights. And then both of these tools are really useful if you think about accommodating and adapting to the changing climate conditions that we're facing and we're expected to face even more in the future in California. So one of the things that we are pretty sure about from the science is that the snowpack that is right now a free storage pretty much every year for us for seasonal water use, basically it keeps a lot of our irrigation water in the form of snow until we need it. that's going to be decreasing because of warming temperatures. And groundwater banking allows you to basically retool the system so that you get more of the over-year storage that's now in above-ground reservoirs down into the ground, so that you can use the surface reservoirs more in replacement of the snowpack. And then water marketing obviously also allows you to, in the same way that it allows to accommodate some shifts in geographic demand and in sectoral demand, to help with shortages that we might face with climate change. So these are all the sort of reasons why they've been promoted as policy tools in California. You can't just go out and do it like selling widgets. There are a lot, the water system is complicated, a lot of interactions among the different users. There are environmental consequences of how we use water. So there are various rules and requirements that we have in place to do both of these tools. My first bullet here is actually more just a physical requirement, that you can't actually sell between parties if you can't get the water from one place to another. Turns out California has a pretty amazing infrastructure for moving water around and for connecting people in various parts of the state if you compare with just about anywhere else in the world. What it means is when you're transferring water, you're not necessarily having to move a molecule, the exact same molecule, from somebody up north to somebody down in San Diego, but the system allows you, so often through a process of exchanges and so on, to basically get that water because somehow those parties are interconnected. One of the key rules for protecting other people and the environment is that you can only sell what we like to call wet water. That means you can't sell. Some people have what are called paper water rights on the books of water that they haven't been using for quite a while. So the paper rights that they might lay claim to might be much larger than what they use. They can't sell that extra part. They also cannot sell the part of the water that they would be returning to the system. This is something we call return flows. So if you're farming, for example, and you agree to not farm your rice crop, and in exchange for, so that somebody else can use that water in exchange for compensation, you might be applying 6 or 7 units of water to your field, but half of those units are going to be going back into the system because it drains off and goes back in, and somebody else is going to be using that water. You can't sell that part. You can only sell the wet part that you use. And that's to protect other water users who would be using that water downstream. And that can include also protecting the environment, making sure that the environmental flows that are important for wildlife are not impacted adversely. Now, there's a hitch in California's system, which is that we have much more complete protections for surface water users than for groundwater users. And that has led to concerns and some local measures being put in place in some counties to make sure that groundwater users there are protected. It relates also to some protections between the interplay between groundwater and surface water, making sure that groundwater pumpers are not basically taking water from out of the rivers, because sometimes if you pump near a river and you sell that water, you might be selling surface water that somebody has in the river. There are also some concerns about the local economic impacts of land fallowing, especially when there's large amounts of land that is going out of production in order to sell water, and I'll mention that again later on. So groundwater banking, just quickly, also needs some infrastructure. So obviously, you need to be able to get the water to the place where you're going to recharge into the ground. You need to be able to store it. Sometimes that means building particular kinds of spreading basins, spreading ponds, injection wells to do that. You need to be able to pump it out again. And you also need to be able to connect the people that are storing the water with the people that are retrieving it if they're not in the same place. So as you'll see, what I'm going to show you is some banking that's done, whereas people up in the Bay Area, for example, are banking water down in Kern County. There has to be that connection of the pipes so that the folks in the Bay Area can get that water. And what they'll do in that case is take the water out of the system up above that Kern County would have used, and the Kern County folks will use the water in the bank. Water quality, rules are needed to prevent harm to bankers and locals. With banks, this is kind of like this no-injury idea in water marketing. The idea that if you're putting water into a bank and pumping it out, you want to make sure that you're not harming local pumpers. And you also want to make sure that the local pumpers who are not part of the banking operation are not taking your water. And then water quality issues sometimes come up where there are concerns whether or not the quality of the water that you want to recharge in the basin is good enough or is going to harm the native water. And these kind of questions are all sort of dealt with through various approval processes at the state and sometimes at the federal level. Now, give you some quick overview of numbers. I'm going to hit you with a bunch of charts kind of quickly, and you can delve at your leisure into the report to sort of get a more in-depth sense of that. What we did was we pulled together information as best we could on what's been happening in the statewide water market. And then on groundwater banking, we looked at some specific things in a few particular areas. And for the water market, what we did was basically try to look at deals between water agencies. So we're not looking at the very micro level within an irrigation district farmers might be trading. It's very hard to track that in a systematic way. It's easier to sort of track the broader which districts are trading with each other across the state. So that's what you're going to see. So it's an incomplete picture, but it's a pretty comprehensive one, we think. And this is what the whole story looks like from the early 80s up until 2011. I'll just decode for you a little bit the colors here. The big sort of beige bars up there are dry years or critically dry years, so drought periods. The yellow, those are temporary transfers, short-term, one-year transfers. And then the blue bars, there are a couple different shades of blue. Those are long-term and permanent transfers, the amount that actually is moving between parties in deals that might be anywhere from 5 to 75 years long, or in the case of permanent transfers, a permanent sale of rights. And then the orange up there is the additional amount that's committed in these permanent and long-term contracts, but that hasn't actually changed hands in those years. And sometimes those contracts, they have kind of ramp-up clauses. Sometimes you don't get the whole amount of water because it's a drier year and the contract only is delivering a portion of that water. But it gives you a sense of sort of a pretty significant evolution. And in the report, we talk about this as really 3 phases in water market development. And I've kind of bracketed them there for you on the bottom of this graph. So the first phase is really when the market took off. And that was drought-related growth from the late 80s to the mid-90s that you can see almost all of those years there were drought years. And it's really when the market took off. And I'll explain to you a little bit more about that in a minute. And then environment-related growth is what we're calling the second phase. This is where you can see it wasn't dry during that period, mid-90s to early 2000s. Most of those years were actually pretty wet, but market growth continued through that period, and that was really driven much more by a variety of environmental concerns that changed the way we manage water in the state. And then the last period, from 2003 until 2011, this sort of last bracket here is the period where you can see there's a lot more of these long-term and permanent trades become very, very important in the market. But overall, that period is pretty flat. You don't see the same kind of continued growth during that phase. So now I just want to decompose for you a little bit that story and why we broke this up into these phases. So this graph shows you the role of the state and federal governments as direct purchasers of water on this market. I should tell you also, sorry, I didn't say, the units we're looking at here are acre-feet of water traded. And just to give you some sense of the size of the market, by the end of by 2010, 2011, about 2 million acre-feet a year in commitments and about 1,500,000 or 1.5 million acre-feet a year in actual trades. And so about 4 or 5% of water use in California is going through the market now. Okay, so here we go with just breaking this down into these phases, and I've included in this graph just what was happening before the market really took off, so you can see how small it was. And these bars show you the bottom, the darker part, is the direct government purchases, and the blue is other purchases. And the orange line shows you the shares, the share of direct government purchases. Basically, in that early drought phase when the market really took off, we're looking at basically about half of all the purchases were by the state or federal governments, mostly the state in this case. And this was partly, and very importantly, the drought water bank that the state launched and various kinds of drought-related purchases. And we've got one of the authors of that early famous experiment. People from all over the world look at California for this. For the drought water bank that was started in 1991, Steve McCauley, who was at DWR at the time, was one of the evil masterminds of that of that scheme. But this was basically a situation where we were faced with the prospect of across-the-board very draconian rationing because the supply situation was so tight, and the state very quickly got together in the space of, I think, maybe 6 weeks or something like that, and set up a program where they were serving as a broker between willing sellers and willing buyers. There were also a lot of other purchases specifically for wildlife refuges and so on, and the feds got involved in that somewhat too. Now, you can see that in the subsequent periods, the share of the state and federal purchases has come down, but it's still not trivial, and that continues to be some drought year purchases, although smaller in magnitude and in importance than before, and also a lot of environmental water purchases, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So that's story for the first phase, take off with a big boost by the state getting involved directly in the market. Now, the second phase, so these middle bars here, this is when, to our analysis, environmental concerns really drove the continued growth in the market. This is, basically from the mid-'90s when the rains returned until the early 2000s. And I put little stars there to kind of highlight what I want you to focus on. So this first graph to your, that's your left. Okay, to your left, those are volumes. And then this second graph is percentage shares for each of these periods. And the two key important pieces of the story are that the green, that's environmental purchases for the environment, and then the gold, which is purchases by San Joaquin Valley farmers. So the first part is environmental purchases. You can see if you look in the, just as a share, but especially as volume, that environmental purchases went from a sliver in the first period to over 20% of the market. It increased by sixfold, and this was in response to some direct policy decisions to both on the part of the federal government through the Central Valley Project Improvement Act to start purchasing water. There have been some regulatory decisions that some water users had to put more water back into the environment, especially farmers in the San Joaquin Valley on the west side. But then also in complement to that there were going to be purchases of water for wildlife refuges in particular, but also some in-stream flow. And the state federal program called CalFed, but it was especially state money, something was created called the Environmental Water Account, which was doing the same kind of thing of trying to supplement regulatory flows with some additional flows for the environment. That turned out to really affect a lot of different buyers a lot of different sellers got involved in that. Now the second part is the gold, and that's the San Joaquin Valley farm purchases. That relates to the regulatory changes and increased in-stream flow requirements, which meant that a number of farmers, especially on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, had to supplement. Their supplies were cut, their allocations were cut, and they had to supplement it with purchases, and they got very active on the market. So their growth basically contributed to half of the total growth in flows into the market in that period. Now, you can see that there's a shift again in the last period where urban areas, the cities, the orange, they were important during the drought, and they become important again in this last period, and it's for a different reason. It's much less drought-related. It's much more related to preparing supplies for long-term growth. California changed its laws in 2001, made it a legal requirement that anybody wanting to build large development projects, and those are approved by cities and counties, had to prove up at least 20 years of long-term water supply. And water transfers were a way to do that. So you started to see just a lot of deals coming on for both long-term and permanent transfers. The biggest of that was a package of deals on the Colorado River, which was also related to California's need to reduce its overall use of the Colorado River. So there was a deal brokered where agricultural districts, in particular the Imperial Irrigation District, was going to be making water available for urban areas in SoCal. But then you have, in the report, there's a detailed list, just these deals happening all over the state, in the San Joaquin Valley, some in the Sac Valley, various in Southern California. And the numbers here, just to walk you through the bar chart quickly, here the green is short-term trades, so the one-year trades. The orange is long-term flows under long-term deals. The brown is flows under permanent deals. And then the lighter colors are just the additional amount committed in those long-term and permanent deals. And you can see that now short-term deals are, less than half of the total. So really, really a significant shift. Now these are mostly for cities, as I mentioned, over half. But there are also some for farms. We're seeing more and more of that now, and some for environmental uses. Okay, so that's the first part of this last phase. The second part is the slowdown in market growth. And the way we talked about, Liz and I talked about this in our op-ed in the Beat today, is that if you think about one of the roles of the market as being able to help during droughts, you expect there to be an increase in short-term trades during dry times. And that really almost didn't happen during this most recent drought. And so here, this graph just highlights that last phase for you from the initial chart that I showed you of long-term trends in water marketing. So this is from 2003 to 2011. You can see that there was barely an uptick. During the drought years, we estimate that maybe 500,000 to 600,000 acre feet in all over a several-year period were transferred specifically for drought relief. And this is because of a variety of issues that kind of hit the system. If you remember, I was talking about the requirements for water marketing. You need to have infrastructure that can allow you to get stuff from one place to the other. This was a period, this most recent drought that started in 2007 was a period of increased pumping restrictions in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And transfers are the lowest on the totem pole when it comes to priority for moving things through. And when there's a constraint there, they were hit heavily by that. And then there were a number of new institutional constraints. And, just completely different system from when the first drought water bank was launched in '91, where it was sort of very quick and kind of figuring, okay, we'll fix things as we go along, and kind of if there are problems, we'll find out about it and adjust it. In a sense, you could say that we've kind of gotten to a point where we've adjusted so many problems that we're over-adjusting, in my mind at least, and the system, we're kind of scared to make approvals anymore. It's gotten very complex, not transparent, very, very frequently changing approval process with respect to environmental issues relating to what's okay and what's not causing injury. This is especially for transfers from the Sac Valley to point south, which are important during droughts. So just a couple more on transfers quickly to give you a sense of some of the other trends. What's been happening geographically is kind of an interesting shift, and part of this relates, I think, to the maturing of the market. Part of it relates to some of these constraints I just mentioned. Trades are becoming much more local. This graph shows you the green is the share between parties in the same county. Has gone from, back in the early drought, in the late 80s or early 90s drought, from less than 20% to now about half. And you can see overall the orange is trades within the same region. So that's increased so that now about 3/4 of all trades are within regions, which is something designed to lower conflict for sure, because some folks are especially worried about exporting water out of their region. But it also suggests sometimes some of these institutional obstacles too. So for example, Modesto Irrigation District recently was was in negotiations with the city of San Francisco for a transfer of water that would have paid Modesto, I think, 100 times more per acre foot than what the farmers were paying, something like some orders of magnitude more than what the farmers were paying there. The irrigation district was going to use this for some costly infrastructure repairs, and local objections by other parties in the county basically didn't want the water to leave, led them to nix it. So here's another just quick geographical overview. There's more of that in the report if you want to your heart's desire, see where the water's flowing, where it's coming from. there's been a big shift in imports and exports and the patterns of that. So this is for the three phases. The green is the first phase, orange is the middle phase, and then the beige is the most recent phase. Sacramento Valley, anything below this bar is net exports out of the region. Sacramento Valley is going to be a net exporter in general because there's more water up here and the demand is not as high, just there are not as many people. Was a big supplier during the early 90s drought. Still net exporter, but you can see sort of the story of inability to support drought-related market demands in the most recent period. What's really SoCal, biggest importer, and that's even though we're counting Imperial Irrigation District together with Southern California urban, they're still importing water from outside of the region. That's where there's a lot of the growth. San Joaquin Valley is the really interesting one. That's where most of the market action is actually. More internal trades, more environmental sales, and you can see that they've actually become a net exporter of water. Even though there are a lot of water scarce folks within the region. So there's a lot of trades internally as well as sales to Southern California. So environment. Just one quick picture on that. You saw that that's about 20% of the market. It still is about 20% of the market for that whole most recent period, although that's falling now. These are just kind of broken up into the different kinds of purposes that the water gets used for. It's contentious because some people don't like the idea of using public money to pay for environmental water. They'd rather just see regulatory cutbacks. Our view is that this can lessen conflicts. A hybrid strategy can be a good one. It can also provide some incentives to water managers to be more efficient about how they manage their water, environmental water management. But we're running out of cash for a lot of these programs now, and so there's a real question of what this is going to look like in the future. For this whole period, water users themselves only paid for less than 30% of the water. Most of it was taxpayers, and most of that was actually the state bonds. So, a little bit quickly on groundwater banking. There are several kinds of groundwater storage in California. Formal management plans, adjudicated basins, special management districts like the Orange County Water District or the Santa Clara Valley Water District, where there's a very formally managed thing where you can't just pump water the way you feel like it. You either have your rights to it or you have to pay a specific amount. Then there's informal, which is much more common, where various water agencies around the state recharge the basin with surface water that they have available. They might use price incentives to encourage people to pump less groundwater and use surface water, but there's not a formal accounting system. And then semi-formal, which is what you're seeing now, especially in Kern County. These are where you're doing some formal accounting for your bank members, but there are other local users who are kind of able to pump the way they want. And you kind of work that out through more informal rules. So what we focused on are some banking operations in some of the formal areas in Southern California and the semi-formal ones in Kern County that do a specific thing, which is relatively new, which really got started in the mid-90s, which is banking for off-site parties. So instead of just recharging for local pumpers, you're running an operation of storage for other people. It might be elsewhere in the county. It might be in other regions. And this has actually turned out to be pretty phenomenally big in Kern County. We present data on that in different ways in the report. This just sort of summarizes for you Kern County balances and the amount of water that's been taken out. Balances are in orange. Right now, there are, I think, about 3 million acre-feet stored in these banks in Kern County. It's about half Kern County folks and half folks elsewhere, Bay Area, Southern California, elsewhere in the San Joaquin Valley, about an even split between urban and ag. Metropolitan Water District of Southern California has been doing this as well with folks down in SoCal. So they're one of the players in Kern, but they're also doing it in SoCal, Coachella Basin, in the Mojave Basin, outside of their service area, and then within the Met service area. Smaller, but important for Met. And this just shows you what these banks combined did during the drought. You remember how the water market stayed flat. You can see that the banks basically were at their maximum in 2006, the year before the drought hit, and they drew down a lot of water, almost to 1.9 million acre-feet. And they were very lucky. They were able to do a lot of recharge really quickly because it was so wet in 2011 that the delta pumping restrictions were not as inhibiting. But there are some concerns that were raised by this, and particularly in Kern County, where it is a less formally managed thing, in that some local users were upset about falling groundwater tables. You know, everybody was pumping more during the drought, but they were blaming the banks. So that has led to some discussions and some negotiations among the parties there. So I just wrap up with one slide to sort of just highlight for you some of our policy recommendations, and I'm hoping that the guys will talk about some of these a bit. We just kind of call out some things that it makes sense to really think about from a policy perspective. One is addressing infrastructure gaps. These matter for both marketing and banking. The delta is one of the key ones. There are others. Making the institutional review process more consistent and transparent and predictable. Strengthening local groundwater management so that you don't have the kind of conflicts that are now happening in Kern County, so that you get to a point where there's a sort of more uniform set of rules for local users and for bankers. Developing models to mitigate local economic impacts from fallowing, and Metropolitan Water District and the San Diego County have been pioneering this, and I think there's some lessons to learn there. We think pursuing more environmental transfers and therefore finding some more money for that is a good idea. And then, to make a lot of this work, it really seems that there's a need to get high-level leaders more engaged again in this and involved in order to take some of the needed risks and break through some of the barriers. That was really key in getting the drought water bank going initially back in the early 90s. It was key for the Colorado River deals. It was key for some of the changes in groundwater banking rules, and it's going to need to be key again. And with that, I thank you, and I'm going to now introduce our panel. Come on up, guys. So we have an illustrious group here. You're in for a treat. Curt Aikens, who is the general manager of Yuba County Water Agency, which has been one of the pioneers on the selling leasing side of water transfers, that, among other things in his resume. They've been involved in a long-term transfer that we cite as a model for other transfers, the Yuba Accord. Then we've got Steve Hirsch from the Metropolitan Water District, who is which is one of the leading players, as you saw, for groundwater banking, but also on the buying side in water marketing. Steve is based up here in Sacramento and has been dealing with a lot of the things related to Sacramento Valley and San Joaquin Valley. And then we've got Andy Sawyer, who is one of the key players at the State Water Resources Control Board on this issue. He works is the assistant general counsel there and working on water rights, and the state board is one of the places that does the approvals for water transfers and is also important for groundwater banking. So I'm going to enjoy what you guys have to say now. And then after this, we'll open it up for questions. And there's a little bit more on everybody's bios on the back of your agenda. So thank you.
So who goes first, me?
Yeah, I think we'll just go.
Anyway, my name's Curt Aikens. I'm the general manager of the Yuba County Water Agency. And just a little quick short background about YCWA. We were formed in 1959 to address water supply issues and flood protection issues. We have broad responsibility and powers in both those areas. We built the Yuba River Development Project, basically 966,000 acre-foot New Bullards Bar Reservoir, to address these water supply plus a dedicated flood protection space in the reservoir for flood protection. And right now we have contracts for about 80,000 acres of irrigated agriculture within Yuba County that we serve through 8 irrigation districts. Some of you may know about the Yuba Accord. That was really a solution to a water rights issue of are our in-stream flows protective enough of the fish in the Yuba River, specifically the anadromous fish, the salmon and steelhead. These things take a long time to solve. That was in 1988 when that complaint was filed with the state board. 2006 was when we had a formal agreement, or at least a draft one in 2008 when the formal one was done. And basically that took a lot of interest. YCWA had an interest of reliable water supply to our customers. We also had been a large participant in water transfers, and that was our funding source for improving flood protection. enabled us to do 186, or contribute the local share to $186 million setback levy on the Feather River as part of our flood protection efforts within the county. And of course, the environmental issues in the Yuba River. And so this was a multi-interest process. We were able to get together with all the parties, come up with a settlement, take it to the state board, get it approved, and in essence approved long-term transfers of both surface water and groundwater substitution water. And just a little history on groundwater substitutions. We've had 7 transfers in the last 20 years, totaling about 430,000 acre feet, or a little bit more than 60,000 acre feet in a transfer year. We've transferred up to as much as 100. We figure our basin is capable about of 180,000 acre feet over a 3-year period. And you need infrastructure to do this. We have the infrastructure at New Bullard's Bar, so we can hold water up there, then release it when it can get past the delta to the buyers. There's a lot of infrastructure with the wells, but we coordinate it. And just for everybody's purposes, the groundwater substitution is what we do is instead of a farmer using the surface water that they have under contract, they forego that. We store that water in New Bullard's Bar. They pump groundwater to irrigate their crops. We have a no fallowing rule within Yuba County. It's a really poor county, and we didn't want to see the secondary and tertiary effects of all that. And then the surface water the surface water is released from New Bullard's Bar at a time where it can go down south and facilitate the transfer. Part of the success of our program is very extensive basin monitoring, so we don't impact third-party users. It's all about information and communication. And there's those entities, the farmers, that can participate in our program and make some money off these groundwater substitution programs. And then there's somebody just right across the road that can't participate. They see their water level going down during these dry years. And we've been very successful with a lot of information, what's happened to the groundwater tables and how does that affect them. And that's been a real key to the whole thing. We have over 200 production wells. We monitor the water depth and water quality, and we have a very active third-party response plan. If there's a problem, we find out about it. The districts are basically go out and within 24 hours contact that party. And it's pretty much, hey, if there's a problem, it's a cost of doing business. Even if it isn't the fault of the water transfers, we've gone out and fixed wells that just to eliminate the problem and not have the issues come up. I'd like to tag on to a little bit of what Ellen said. Infrastructure matters, both for marketing and banking. For us, a lot of the issue, I've described the infrastructure within the county. That's New Bullard's Bar. It's all the wells that the farmers have. But we rely a lot on the delta, and having that infrastructure work well to get water past the delta. And, that's very important for successful programs to go forward. On a local basis, we're blessed with a lot of runoff, and this is the time of the year where I say usually, our basin is dual factors. One, it's a blessing we get a lot of water in the dry years, but hopefully this isn't one of those years where we get a lot of water, too much water in the wet years when it's just a curse and stuff. But we've had major flooding in 1986 and 1997. Another item I want to touch on with Ellen's comments is transfer must prevent injury to the environment and other legal users of the state waters. But the institutional review process is unnecessarily complicated and cumbersome. When we've done a whole bunch of single-year transfers, and really to make one of those work, we found we had to start about June or July or August and work it all the way through. It takes an incredible amount of time. You have to produce an environmental report. You got to produce other reports, what's going to happen with the groundwater basin and all that. And I tell you, it's really nice to have all that behind us with a long-term transfer program like the Yuba Accord, but we put in, millions of dollars into into the environmental analysis so we could come up with this long-term program. And so it is very time-consuming, very expensive to move forward with these things. I'm looking at the time, and you know what? I'm just going to pass it on to the next person because I don't want to use up everybody's time.
Okay, thanks, Curt. I'm Steve Hirsch. I'm the program manager for water transfers and exchanges for Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. And this particular report, I'm very appreciative that PPIC came out with because it touches the two areas I've worked in for the past 15 years. But I think it's going to be very important to water managers throughout the state. To give you a feel for how important these tools are for Metropolitan, when we go into a water year, we're essentially have a 50-50 chance of either needing to store 1 million acre feet of water, find places to store that water, or needing to recover 1 million acre feet, needing to pull from storage, go to the transfer market. And so these two water management tools are very important to Metropolitan. They're very interrelated too, and I'll touch a little bit more about this later. So as the report suggests, Metropolitan has made a lot of investment in storage, and Ellen points to how groundwater was so important during the recent drought and transfers less so. Well, they're interrelated. We didn't need to go to the transfer market so much because we were able to pull from groundwater supplies. So I think that's an important connection to talk about. I wanted to just get you in the mind frame of a water transfer program manager. It's not as fun as it looks. I call it the game you will never win, and it's a nightmare in many respects. And so I cut my teeth exactly 10 years ago, the first time Metropolitan went out and did transfers in 2003. We bought 145,000 acre feet, committed to buy that water when our allocation was 45% in February and March, and then had this thing called Awesome April, which is kind of what we're expecting here, I guess, this next week. Our state project supply doubled. We had 90% allocation. So we had $13 million of transfer supplies isolated above the delta, no ability to get it. Well, 2/3 of that water went out to the ocean. We didn't end up getting a third just 7 years later. And then fast forward to today, this year, there's some transfers that a number of other state water contractors are involved in where they spent over $15 million. The water accrued to them in Lake Oroville. A problem we have never even thought about occurred, and that's inability to get the water out of Oroville. And so this water is stranded in Oroville. They could have got it through the delta, but due to some infrastructure problems at Lake Oroville, that water is stranded. So just think of going to bed at night and you've got $15 million floating on the top of Lake Oroville with these storms coming in. And when Oroville fills, this water is going to spill. And so I point this out because transfers are inherently risky. And so I think that's why it's important that when we can get our arms around a situation, something that's in our control, let's try to do that. And I think that's what the PPIC recommendations point towards. So I wanted to talk about some of the recommendations. As far as addressing infrastructure gaps, the odd thing is the infrastructure is there, but it's really the environmental regulations that govern the operations of the Delta plants that make things difficult. And specifically, we're limited to moving transfer supplies through the Delta to 3 months out of the year, July, August, September. Well, if I'm negotiating for a rice fallowing transfer, I'm paying for water I'm going to receive 5 months of the year, May, June, July, August, September. And I need to find a way to store that May, June water, and it's very difficult to do. So what this essentially has done, either I can buy the water and just say I'm going to lose 40% right off the bat, or I could just ignore that part of the market. It's a huge part of the market that because of the biological opinions in the Delta no longer is accessible. That's huge. So that's important, the Delta biological opinions. I'll take a drink of water here. Another recommendation, make institutional review process more consistent, transparent, and predictable. One of the things you hear if you work in the transfer market is, gee, if DWR, Department of Water Resources, and the Bureau of Reclamation just got out of the way, everything would be great. Not true, it'd be chaos. We need them to play a role, specifically the real water role that Ellen talked about, ensuring that when we buy water, it's water that would have otherwise been consumptively used. And we're learning as we go. You know, there was a lot of well-paid tribute to the 1991 Drought Water Bank. I'm looking at Steve McCauley as I say this. But the fact of the matter is they did that quickly. It's amazing how much water they got together. But today with the new rules, we might not have bought all that water. there might have been some water that wasn't real water. So we're getting smarter about that, and DWR is working through those issues. That said, I think there's some areas where DWR can improve. This transparency on the annual technical guidelines that come out. You need to know what the rules are before you can negotiate a transfer. And one of my pet peeves in working with DWR is saying, let's get these rules down in place so that we can negotiate deals. If we were coming off a dry year, I'd be negotiating transfers right now. I don't know what the rules are for 2013. That's a problem. Pointing to some of the other recommendations, develop models to mitigate local economic impacts. I have mixed feelings about that because in 2003 we actually set aside $5 an acre foot to deal with this issue. And I'm only aware, I'm looking at Dave Elijah, of one issue where that money was spent. Otherwise there were no claims. And I remember the sellers telling us, it puts us on the defensive putting this money forward. When we do transfers, we limit the transfers in any district to 20% fallowing of the district, purposely to help avoid large fallowing in any particular district. And I've been struck by two conversations over the years. One was a director from Western Canal who told me he needed transfers in order to make his farming business viable over the long term, to rest the land, to work the land, to have a revenue stream when commodities are low. And then I look at Western Canal, who participated in the Drought Water Bank, kept $3 million of the proceeds, built new infrastructure, which resulted in them having no risk of ever having supplies cut off from the Endangered Species Act. This is good for the local economy. So I have mixed feelings, as Ellen mentioned, where we've had more intensive fallowing within the Colorado districts. We have up front put some mitigation funds. The last policy recommendation, engage high-level leaders who can take needed risks. This is a problem. We were blessed at a time. We had a person at DWR who understood the nuts and bolts of transfers and had a direct linkage to the executive level. I'll just mention his name is Jerry Johns. I don't know if he's here, but we were spoiled. But we know the potential. We know it can happen. And so right now, if you're at the state or federal government, there's no incentive to take any risks at this point. So we've got a very risk-adverse environment, which doesn't help transfers at all. And then I'm just going to comment on a few trends. This will only take me a second, outlined in the report. The long-term and permanent water transfers, this trend towards it, it's accurate. But I think I'm not sure if it's going to continue because it's really the result of two big settlements, the quantification settlement agreement on the Colorado River and then the Monterey agreement on the state project. And so that's why you're seeing this increased trend of exports out of the San Joaquin Valley. But that was a capped amount of 130,000 acre feet under the Monterey agreement. The slowing market, some of it's due to our better ability to judge what's real water. That's not a bad thing. North to south trades are down. I'd point right to the biological opinions at this point in the Delta. And then just lastly, ground banking versus transfers. I don't see it as one outperforming the other. If groundwater banking is performing well for Metropolitan, we don't need transfers. And so to me, that's why I'm just so grateful you guys put these together because I think that link's important. And that concludes my comments.
As Ellen mentioned, I'm Andy Sawyer, Assistant Chief Counsel at the California State Water Resources Control Board. The State Water Resources Control Board approval is required for transfers that require a change in the surface water rights, that's permitted and licensed surface water rights administered by the State Water Resources Control Board. I hasten to add in that regard, most water transfers do not need State Water Resources Control Board approval, and most of the complaints you're hearing now about changing and transparent approval processes are not referring to our approval processes. They're referring to the approval processes of other agencies. Also, as Ellen mentioned, when water is stored underground, it's largely governed by the surface water rights of where the water came from. And again, if that's under a water right permit and license, it's governed by the rules governing permits and licenses administered by the State Water Resources Control Board. I'd like to focus on two issues raised in the reports. One of the conclusions in the reports is that the water market is maturing. And that's shown in the preceding report and in this one. Water transfers have been a topic of interest, at least since the 1970s. For a long time, it seemed we had more conferences and papers than we had transfers. And we also had a lot of proposals that basically amounted to making water transfers easier by allowing transfers of paper water. Some, of course, it was not proposed in that way. It was proposed as streamlining. And in fact, some streamlining was possible in legislation, I think drafted by Cliff Lee, certainly proposed by the Governor's Commission on California Water Rights Law. Streamlining of the State Water Board's approval was proposed. That was later amended in 1988, and that's been an important part in the transfer process. But as Professor Buzz Thompson wrote in an article about institutional perspectives on water transfers, the degree to which the statutory review process can be eased or streamlined is limited. The principal impediment to statutory transfers in most states lies not in the overly restrictive laws or poorly designed procedures, but in the rational legal decision to protect other appropriators, both to ensure that transfers are efficient and to provide junior appropriators with a modicum of security. The law must protect juniors from injurious transfers. Yet so long as the law does, the sheer hydrologic uncertainty involved in determining whether a transfer will affect downstream appropriators will inevitably produce sizable administrative costs. Those same concerns apply to environmental protection. It's hard work putting a transfer together to make sure it's wet water, it doesn't unreasonably affect the environment, and it doesn't injure other water right holders. And that's what we've seen in the maturation of the transfer process, is transfers put together doing the hard work of dealing with all those issues, plus the hydrologic uncertainty. Steve mentioned that many of the transfers are in response to what might be seen as specific hits on the water supply, where, if, for example, when California had to reduce its diversions from the Colorado River from 5.2 million acre feet to 4.4 million acre feet, there was a need for a lot of transfers to better and more efficiently distribute the limited water available. I don't think we've seen the last of that. I just don't know where the next hit will come from. Although certainly, as Ellen said, climate change means that our effective water supply goes down because less is stored in snowpack and comes at rain, but we have to get through the system quickly to avoid flooding problems. So we can expect more instances like the 4.4 plan, the quantitative settlement agreement, where there are transfers. I just don't know what will be the impetus for that. Another point that Buzz Thompson mentioned in his article and Ellen mentioned is the institutional resistance to water transfers, where water transfers may make good economic sense, but there's resistance locally, as Ellen discussed in the Modesto Irrigations District's decision to back out of a proposed water transfer to San Francisco. This is going to continue to be a concern because in California, more than any other Western state, water deliveries are made by public agencies so that public institutions will be in control of that process and affected by those kinds of concerns. With respect to groundwater banking, it's certainly encouraging to see that we have more groundwater banking. It's also an important part of promoting transfer because sometimes the water is available in one year and it's needed in another. And as I think Steve said, it has numerous advantages over using surface water storage, in part because you can lose your water in surface water storage, whereas you can there's a great deal of storage capacity in our groundwater basins. There have been some important legal developments in this area. One was the Second District Court of Appeals decision in Central and West Basin Water Replenishment District versus Southern California Water Company in 2003. That's recent by water law standards, that the unused storage capacity in a groundwater basin is a public resource. This means that if you want to store water underground, you don't need permission from all the overlying landowners, which would effectively make underground storage impossible. And the law clearly establishes that if you store water that would not otherwise find its way into the aquifer, for example, when you import water from one basin into another and store it underground, you have the right to take that water back out as against anyone who has a water right to take from the underground basin. That principle was reaffirmed just last week in a decision by the 6th District Court of Appeal involving the Santa Maria Basin, City of Santa Maria versus Adam. A case involving groundwater recharge, that water that's diverted to storage, which would otherwise have flowed out to sea, and instead was stored underground. What I find particularly interesting in the update on groundwater banking is that it's working in groundwater basins that aren't managed. And I'm thinking, why doesn't somebody else just steal the water? There are, as I see it, two reasons. First, we're talking about groundwater basins that, although they're in overdraft, have a vast amount of water in storage. So as long as you can pump it back out before everybody else pumps it dry, then you can make use of your stored water. And second, as I mentioned, the law is clear that if you store the water underground and it wouldn't get there naturally, you have the right to take it out. So long as you've done an adequate accounting, nobody's going to be able to get an injunction or court case to stop you from taking it out. So that leads to my final question. If we're able to conduct groundwater banking in basins that are not managed, why is one of the recommendations here that we need better groundwater management? And I think the problem is illustrated by another question you asked or pointed out. Why didn't we rely more on transfers in response to the most recent drought? If you look what we did during the drought, we did some transfers, we did some increased water efficiency, reduced water use, especially in our urban areas, and we pumped groundwater like crazy. Westlands is a good example. They participated in a big way in the water market, but they participated in a bigger way in increasing their groundwater pumping. And put simply, we're not going to transfer more water to the extent we have cheaper alternatives. That's okay if the alternative is water conservation. After all, the goal here is efficiency, not just increasing the number of transfers. And if you're getting greater efficiency through conservation, that's as good or better than getting greater efficiency through transfers. Likewise, if you have a situation like you have in many of our managed Southern California basins, where you pump the water out in dry periods, but you recharge it in wet periods so that you maintain a safe yield, that too is just as good or better than a transfer. But if you're increasing groundwater pumping in overdrafted basins, eventually you're going to run out. You're basically increasing pumping because it's cheaper to the user, but to overall society, including the other groundwater users, this is not a more efficient way. And perhaps that's going to be the next hit, where we have to find a lot of water through transfers, is to make up for the groundwater basins we failed to protect.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to give these guys all a chance to exchange a little bit with each other and wrap up at the end. But first, I want to give you all a chance to ask some questions or throw out some stuff. Alf.
Okay, so I've heard all of you talk solely about water transfer side, not the groundwater piece. So water transfer side. You've all talked about the review process and could be used improvement. But I've heard a number of you mention things that could happen without legislation. So I'm wondering, my question is, do you think that there needs to be some new thing legislatively, or is this something that just needs to get worked out administratively among various levels of government and, all that?
So I'm just going to repeat the question for the recording. So the question is whether, with respect to water transfers, there's a need for new legislation, or can things be worked out non-legislatively?
Well, it's always fearful when you ask the legislature to fix something for you here. You don't know what you're going to get. So I have hope that we can deal with this administratively, and part of that is reflecting back on how working with DWR and the Bureau was a few years ago, where we had this direct linkage on the ground with executive management, and it was like if this person that was Jerry, who I mentioned, understood the issue, resolved it, and if he believed it, executive management was going to follow it. So it was just kind of one-stop shopping. And so I'd like to think we could deal with it administratively.
And I'd agree with that. I mean, in putting the Yuba Accord together, it was the champions that you could find and make sense out of this in the big picture, cut through the bureaucracy, cut through the misperceptions, and say this is a good thing not only for a local entity like Yuba County Water Agency, but making water available to other parts of the state when it's needed. And it's that leadership that you look for to make these things go forward, because they're so complex. And so many unique issues come up. I don't think you could legislate that type of thing. I think it would just make it more bureaucratic, more difficult to go through, and somehow we just need to find a way of getting that leadership and those champions in place to take care of this.
We found a question we can all agree on.
Okay. Next question from the back there.
Yeah, these things about leadership, champions, and all. The whole discussion happened without a mention of word public trust. And in terms of institutional credibility, a large amount of water is held in trust for the public and future generations. And shouldn't that responsibility be a bigger part of the discussion? As I mean, there's all kinds of things that make it more convenient for people with money to do things. And right now, real estate values have fallen incredibly, and people don't even know what the value is of their houses, okay, which is supposedly a big part of the California dream and everything. I'm really grateful for Andy Sawyer saying, well, wait a second, there is such a thing as a public interest that's happened. And the economics, how do you account for the public trust in California water?
So, question of how does one account for the public trust in California water?
There's actually been some disagreement between public trust advocates and the State Water Board on this issue. I emphasized the importance of making sure that transfers do not unreasonably affect fish, wildlife, or other in-stream beneficial uses. Basically, do not unreasonably affect in-stream beneficial uses. What we haven't done is held transfers hostage to say you can't transfer until you fix up the public trust problems that are already there. And I think that if we did that, we wouldn't fix the public trust problems, we'd just block transfers. And that decision is long behind us, that we'll look at the impacts of the transfer itself, but not try to fix everything else as a condition approval of the transfer.
That's another one we can agree on, probably. Okay. Yes.
You discussed in certain isolated situations community resistance to transfers, and there are frequently local business agricultural concerns that bring that on. On the broader picture, there are some instances where it would appear there's a community resistance that's part of a no or slow growth policy. For example, the current lawsuit challenging the very legality of the Kern Water Bank. And I certainly won't speak for the petitioners in that case, but there seems to be some opposition on the grounds that water transfers facilitate urban growth or commercial growth. And I think, Steve, you may be the best to answer this. What do you see as the challenges in the best use of transfers that might come from that sort of more general resistance?
Well, in our case, we're going to the market to meet demands in very extreme situations where it's very dry and it's very we have high demands in Southern California. So I don't see the transfers that we're doing is necessarily facilitating growth. I'm not sure I fully captured your comment, and I'm answering it, but
sorry,
did I miss something?
Yeah, no, and for the video audience, the question was about basically whether legal actions to slow growth are part of the group of obstacles that transfers face. In some cases, and the example was raised of the lawsuit against the Kern Water Bank.
There's examples of groundwater ordinances that are put in place, I would say, for like Butte County, that for whatever reasons they were put in place, they've effectively killed the transfer market of groundwater out of that county, because it's really, you look at the process, you look at what you have to go through to get to the end point, and it's too difficult, so.
There are two, this is not really a public trust issue. I don't think it's a growth resistance issue. There's an attitude that it's our water. We should have control about it, and that comes in two ways. One is the idea of public ownership, and a lot of the opposition to the Kern Water Bank stems from the fact that it's effectively been transferred into private ownership, and it's a strong progressive era feeling that these are public resources, they ought to be in public ownership. Then you have what Steve mentioned is an attitude in a lot of areas that the water in our county, our city, our watershed, it's different definitions how it is ours. We shouldn't be selling it to San Francisco or Los Angeles or someplace remotely, and that's part of the institutional resistance to water transfers is that in many cases, for example, the Yuba Accord, conjunctive use allows Yuba County area, the Yuba County Water Agency service area, to make transfers to other parts of the state without injury to the local interests. And yet sometimes in some areas you get such strong interest to protecting the local supply that you can't work out those kinds of solutions.
And just from a local perspective, there's fears out there that if you start transferring water, it'll always be transferred and you'll never be able to take it back for in-county use. And it takes a lot of education, takes a lot of information to work with the people. And what we found in Yuba County is now that people see the benefit of that from a public perspective, because we're able to make money, and then we're able to reinvest that money, according to our mission, and flood protection and stuff. And so it takes a lot of education, and it's a continuous program. And it's not just in the transfer years; it's every year. We're out there producing a groundwater management report. We're producing statistics on what the aquifer levels are. We're dealing with issues of how this affects, areas that aren't getting revenue from these water transfer programs. And so it's an ongoing expense.
Down there.
Andy mentioned the value of accurate accounting and groundwater banking, illustrated through a couple of recent legal cases. And I was just wondering, what's the progress on managing these balances more so based on water levels rather than just budgetary analysis? Because in its current state, particularly in non-adjudicated basins, the balances determined, just by the ins and outs, and those assumptions are really a lot less reliable than those that could be obtained with water level reading. So I know there's obviously a lot of hurdles with privately owned wells and confidentiality, but until we can really verify water balances with water levels, we really have half true knowledge of our accounting.
So the question is relating to measurement of what's happening in groundwater basins and whether accounting of recharge and retrieval amounts is enough, or whether what progress there's been with measuring groundwater levels, which is obviously the outcome that you're caring about. And I'll just chip in here first, I think, which in the report we talk a little bit about the broader groundwater management issue and groundwater banking, and there's a reason why we're only showing you data from the banks that are storing for offsite parties. DWR estimates that there are about 90 local agencies that are doing some form of conjunctive use storage, and as this has been something that's been pointed out in several water plans since 2005, groundwater storage conjunctive use is a very important water management tool for California. It's part of California's policy. So as after the last water plan in 2009, part of DWR's work plan on the groundwater side was to get some better numbers on this. And in that context, they have been contacting the folks in these agencies with written survey and then with phone calls to try to get a handle on various aspects of what's been happening with conjunctive management. It's been really hard. And so you can go to the September meeting presentations from the public advisory for the water plan, and there's a good presentation on how they've done with that. And it's piecemeal enough that it's going to still be super impressionistic, and the reason one gets, sometimes you just don't get a response to a survey for random reasons, but part of it is just a lot of local reluctance to provide information. Now, the law has changed so that levels have to be reported, and so you guys are probably having to report groundwater levels to DWR. Curt, around the state, this is something that was passed as a sort of compromise in late 2009, and DWR has also been using sort of monitoring data that it had before. So another kind of cool presentation on that in the September website is an initial attempt to look at what's happening with groundwater levels within different parts of the Central Valley. The story that they find, and that's also referenced in our report, is that as of 2010, everybody was pumping during the drought. That's what you're supposed to do. As of 2010, the Sac Valley, which is usually in pretty good shape anyway, was pretty much back up to where it was pre-drought. Upper San Joaquin, doing better. Tulare Basin, which is where all the Kern stuff is, was still not looking good at all. Now, whether 2011 was as good for the rest of the basin as for these banks is a question. But anyway, I don't know if you guys have things you want to add to that.
Just a little. To effectively manage a water resource, you need adequate information. There have been many attempts in the legislature to require reporting statewide of groundwater extractions. They are now reported in 4 Southern California areas. That could not pass. Instead, what the legislature enacted in the 2009 special session is reporting or determination of groundwater levels. That's a step in the right direction, but if you know groundwater levels and don't know the extractions, that's kind of like trying to manage your checkbook when you know the account balance, but you don't know who's writing the checks or or how much. So we need better information of all kinds, including inputs, extractions, and water levels.
I would just say for our partnerships in the San Joaquin Valley, there's some just general principles. You can't take more water than you put in. You leave behind 10% of the water. The facilities, and we're talking about tens of $millions of dollars we invest in each of our programs, not only available for us to store our waters, they're available to the local partner. They own and operate these facilities, so their groundwater levels, while we have groundwater stored with them, are higher. They're able to capture more. So I'm not seeing, I understand with the drought water bank because that was transferred from state ownership to local. There's some issues there, but I'm not seeing this concern about like Semi, ARB, and Kern Delta, the other programs we're involved in.
I'd just like to add on a local basis, we had a basin that was overdrafted to a tune of 100 feet. We brought in surface water irrigation. It recharged it. A lot of benefit, even though we don't provide surface water to municipal entities, which are the vast majority of source for the water for the people in Yuba County. They've all benefited by seeing the water table go up. And I'll say, from my perspective, local control of this is really the most effective way, because part of my board is also the 5-county Board of Supervisors. And, there's a really good balance there, and we're able to address the issues. And just to get back, it's information, it's communication, it's addressing people's questions that make this work on a local basis. It's been very effective for us, because not only do we have a resource where we have reliable water supply, but we've been able to bring money into a really poor county and produce good things for the public.
So one more quick question, and we're going to go to Cliff.
Hi. For those of us who've been around on water transfers, I think we all know that the concept is that at once overly sold and also overly condemned. Those who opposed it said it'll turn water surplus areas into Owens valleys, and those who oversold it have said that it would provide for a significant replacement for infrastructure and water supply transfer and development facilities. One of the things that struck me reading this report is the line on page 20, where the report says transfers now represent about 5% of all water used by businesses and residents in the state. On the face, that doesn't seem like a very big number. I guess for everyone, including you, Ellen, are we stuck at 5%? Are we going to get larger? And if so, when and how?
Well, we've talked about some of the issues that are having a dampening effect on the transfer market, the biological opinions. Groundwater storage, being able to replenish groundwater basins in wet years has been so helpful to avoiding having to go to the market. And so success in that area directly relates to not needing to do as much transfers. It's hard to say. We've had a couple wet years. I felt like through 2007, or 2008, 2009, 2010, Metropolitan was able to do pretty well in transfer supplies. 2009 would have liked more from Northern California. But it's a combination of things. It's getting the right rules in place. It's maybe some flexibility on the biological opinions, maybe some new infrastructure. So it's a little bit of everything. I don't think there's one fix that I can think of.
A couple of comments on that. One, it's very hard to calculate what percentage is transfers. In doing the report, they had some difficulties in deciding what counts as a transfer for this report. They excluded what they called compliance transfers, but in many respects, the quantitative settlement agreement transfers are compliance with waste and reasonable use issues. The Yuba Accord is compliance in part. It's not exclusively, but dealing with public trust issues. So it's hard to, everything's a compliance transfer a little bit and not entirely, it seems, and it's hard to say what's a transfer or not. And again, our overall concern is efficiency. If an area is served by a transfer, or in the alternative, an area is served because a water supplier expands its place of use, and the water's coming from the same source, what do we care if it's a transfer or it's a direct delivery? It's the same water coming from the same place. What I think is at 5%, the transfer market at least has enough of a role to create an economic incentive. It's kind of like the issue of, can the United States become energy independent? Well, it can produce as much energy as it uses, potentially, but it'll always be affected by the market price because it sells and buys on the market. Similarly, if there's transfers, even at 5%, there will be incentives to conserve water if that conserved water can be used more effectively by someone else, even if it doesn't necessarily directly work in the form of a transfer. That can be something like wheeling. So I think the transfers are getting big enough to help promote efficiency overall in the state, even though some of those efficiencies are not directly used for transfers.
So we did not include in the report a sort of estimate of how big the market ought to get or might get, and that's because there aren't really any good estimates of that. There's optimization modeling that's done that kind of looks at how to manage water smart under all kinds of difficult conditions. And my close colleagues at UC Davis at the Watershed Center, Jay Lund and Richard Howitt and Josue Medina Zuara and others have looked at this and kind of tortured the climate to see, how can we still manage water efficiently and what will be the costs. I think, those scenarios definitely suggest more transfers than what we have now. A big question is going to be whether we continue with environmental water purchases or not. Right now that's about, in the most recent years, 15% of the market, but the money's running out for that. We could look to Australia just to have a sense of what this could, what it could matter, where they have a very similar kind of climate and sort of incentives for water transfers and similar kinds of environmental issues. They are opting to use markets to buy, basically, that's where they're going to get their environmental water, is by buying it, not by regulating, where we've got this hybrid policy, which is, I would say, more regulation and with sort of topped off with purchases. They've also got a lot of mineral money that they can use for that. They also, during their decade-long drought, in the heart of the Murray-Darling Basin, about half of the water was moving through the market. Half of the agricultural water was moving through the market because that was a situation where there were really strong incentives to get it to the very high-value tree crops that people didn't want to see die. And we're nowhere near that yet. And my guess would be maybe the market could double in our collective lifetimes.
So if I could just add a comment from a local perspective. We look at transfers as kind of a relief valve in the whole system. I can't imagine what Steve's job would be like if he couldn't get the transfer water in those dry periods. I go back to the 1991 Water Bank. There were discussions that said, geez, if we don't make a transfer program work, the state's going to declare, a higher and better use for municipal water and just take it from ag customers. And so this is kind of a defensive place for us, as we see, hey, if we've got the water, we can make a system work. We've had the transfer program encourage conservation of water that then makes it available for transfers and stuff. It's really a good market-based system to address these droughts that we have and these water shortages. And the other alternatives, I think, would be pretty painful.
So it's 5 minutes over what we promised as a time to release you all. I think invite you to thank the panel with me and hang around and talk to us informally after, for anybody who can stay. Thank you so much.